In this episode, we're going to focus on authentication, which is the part of access control that answers the question, who are you? And we're going to do it in a way that helps you think clearly about real strengths and real weaknesses. Beginners often hear a list of authentication methods and assume the newest or most complex one must be best, but authentication is not a popularity contest. The strength of authentication depends on what it resists, what it assumes, and what can go wrong in real use. We'll cover passwords as the classic method, multi-factor authentication, MFA, as a major improvement when implemented well, and tokens as a way of proving identity or obtaining access without repeatedly typing secrets. Along the way, we'll focus on practical failure modes, because most authentication failures happen not because the idea is flawed, but because a real-world weakness is exploited, like reuse, phishing, device compromise, or poor recovery processes. When you understand how authentication fails, you also understand how to build it stronger. Start with the core purpose of authentication. It creates confidence that a subject is the same entity that was previously granted an identity. That sounds abstract, but it matters because systems cannot make safe authorization decisions if they do not know who is requesting an action. Authentication is essentially a proof step. The system asks for evidence, and if the evidence matches what the system expects, it accepts the claim. That evidence typically falls into categories like something you know, something you have, and something you are. The reason categories matter is that each category fails differently. Something you know, like a password, can be guessed, stolen, or phished. Something you have, like a token or device, can be stolen or copied, but it is harder to steal remotely in many cases. Something you are, like a biometric, can be difficult to change if compromised, and it can have reliability issues. Strong authentication often means combining categories so that the weaknesses of one are compensated by the strengths of another. Passwords are the most common authentication method, and beginners should understand both why they persist and why they are risky. Passwords persist because they are simple to deploy, easy for systems to verify, and familiar to users. The problem is that passwords place heavy responsibility on human memory and behavior, and humans are not good at generating and managing many unique secrets. This leads to predictable failure patterns, such as weak passwords, reused passwords, and passwords stored insecurely. Another major risk is that passwords can be captured through phishing or through breaches of other systems, then reused against new targets. Even if a password is strong, it can still be stolen, and once stolen, it can be used from anywhere unless additional controls exist. That is why password security is not only about strength rules. It is also about limiting reuse, protecting storage, monitoring for abuse, and adding additional factors for high-risk access. A useful way to understand password strength is to think in terms of guessing difficulty and attacker resources. Weak passwords are often based on common words or patterns that attackers can guess quickly using lists and rules, even without trying every possible combination. Stronger passwords are longer and less predictable, which increases the number of guesses required. But even strong passwords can be compromised through other routes, such as being captured by malware on a device, being entered into a fake login page, or being exposed through a breach of a different service. This is why authentication should not rely on the idea that users will always pick perfect passwords and never make mistakes. Systems should assume some percentage of passwords will be weak, reused, or exposed, and then design additional protections accordingly. That is also why account lockout, rate limiting, and monitoring can matter, because they reduce the effectiveness of guessing attacks. Now let's introduce multi-factor authentication, MFA, which means requiring two or more different types of evidence from different categories. The goal of MFA is to make it much harder for an attacker to authenticate even if they obtain one factor, like a password. If an attacker steals a password, they still need the second factor, which might be a code from a device, a push approval, or a hardware token. This dramatically improves security in many scenarios because it breaks the simple path of password reuse and phishing. However, beginners should avoid the misconception that MFA is automatically unbreakable. MFA can fail if the second factor is also phished, if the user is tricked into approving a login they did not initiate, or if the attacker compromises the device that holds the second factor. Some MFA methods are more resistant to phishing than others, and some are more vulnerable to user error. The key is understanding what type of second factor is being used and what threats it resists. One common MFA method uses one-time codes delivered through a channel like text message, and while this can be better than password only, it has known weaknesses. Messages can be intercepted through account takeover of the messaging channel, number porting fraud, or device compromise. Another common method uses an authenticator app that generates time-based codes on a device, which reduces dependence on the messaging network but still depends on the device being secure and the user not giving codes to a phisher. Push-based approval is convenient but can lead to approval fatigue, where users approve prompts reflexively, especially if attackers spam prompts to wear them down. Hardware tokens can be very strong because they require possession of a physical device and can implement cryptographic challenges rather than human-readable codes, but they have usability and logistics considerations, like loss and replacement. The big beginner lesson is that MFA is a family of approaches, not one single mechanism, and the quality depends on implementation and user behavior. Tokens are another concept beginners often misunderstand, because the word token can mean different things depending on context. At a high level, a token is a piece of data that proves something, often that you have authenticated recently or that you have certain rights. A token can be a physical object, like a hardware key, but it can also be a digital credential issued by a system after successful authentication. In many modern systems, you authenticate once, and then the system gives you a token that you present for subsequent requests. This reduces the need to repeatedly send your password and helps with performance and usability. But tokens also create new risks. If an attacker steals a token, they may be able to act as the user without knowing the password, at least until the token expires or is revoked. That is why token protection and token lifetime matter. Tokens should be treated as sensitive, like keys, because they effectively represent access. A major practical failure mode in authentication is phishing, because phishing targets human trust rather than breaking cryptography. Phishing works by convincing a user to enter credentials into a fake page or to approve a login they did not initiate. Even strong passwords and many MFA methods can be undermined if the user is tricked into giving away the needed information. This is why phishing-resistant approaches are valued, because they reduce the chance that a user can be tricked into authenticating to the wrong party. Another practical defense is making authentication prompts meaningful, so users can tell when something is suspicious. If prompts are constant and confusing, users are trained to click approve without thinking. Authentication design should aim to create clear signals and minimize opportunities for social engineering to succeed. In exam scenarios, if you see repeated suspicious login prompts, you should think about push fatigue and about the need for methods that cannot be easily relayed to a phisher. Another failure mode is account recovery, which is often the weakest link because it bypasses normal authentication requirements. If a user forgets a password or loses a device, the system must provide a way to regain access, and attackers love to attack this pathway. Recovery methods that rely on easily guessed personal information or weak verification can allow attackers to take over accounts without needing to defeat strong authentication directly. For example, if recovery can be triggered through a simple email compromise or through social engineering of support staff, the attacker may bypass MFA. Strong authentication systems treat recovery as a high-risk process, requiring strong verification and careful auditing. This is also where policy and process matter, because support staff need clear rules and training to resist manipulation. For beginners, the takeaway is that authentication is not just the login prompt. It includes everything around identity proofing, enrollment, factor management, and recovery. Session management is another practical area where authentication can fail, even when the initial login is strong. After you authenticate, the system often maintains a session so you do not have to authenticate on every action. If session tokens are stolen, reused, or left active for too long, an attacker may not need to authenticate at all. This is why timeouts, re-authentication for sensitive actions, and protections against token theft matter. It is also why logging out of a system is not just a convenience feature. It is a security action that ends the validity of certain tokens or sessions. Beginners should notice that authentication and authorization are ongoing concerns. A strong initial login does not guarantee safety if sessions are not managed well. In exam questions, scenarios involving stolen cookies, hijacked sessions, or access from unusual locations often relate to session and token protections rather than password complexity. So how do you build strong authentication in a way that is practical and resilient? You start by using passwords that are long and unique, because uniqueness is what breaks the chain reaction where one breach leads to many compromises. You add MFA for accounts where compromise would be damaging, and ideally you choose methods that are resistant to phishing and user manipulation. You protect tokens and sessions by limiting their lifetimes, binding them to contexts when possible, and monitoring for unusual use. You harden account recovery so it cannot be abused as an easy bypass. And you add detection, such as monitoring for unusual login patterns, repeated failures, or logins from unexpected locations, because detection helps you catch compromise early. All of these measures work together, and none of them should be viewed as a single magic shield. Strong authentication is a system, not a feature, and it must be designed with failure in mind. By the end of this episode, you should be able to explain authentication as a layered proof process and to recognize common strengths and weaknesses of passwords, MFA, and tokens. Passwords are simple but vulnerable to reuse, guessing, and theft. MFA raises the bar by requiring additional evidence, but it must be implemented thoughtfully to resist phishing and user error. Tokens improve usability and can represent authenticated identity, but they become valuable targets that must be protected. The practical failure modes, like phishing, recovery abuse, and session hijacking, are what turn a strong idea into a weak system if they are not addressed. When you think about authentication this way, you are prepared to answer questions about which method is most appropriate, which weakness is being exploited, and what control would most effectively reduce risk in a given scenario. That is the mindset that turns authentication from memorized terms into usable security understanding.
Thanks for listening. For more audio courses, daily newsletters, and more, please visit BareMetalCyber.com.